Welcome to another history with Humphreys and Reed, but something different this time. So it's me, Paul Reed, military historian.
And me, Dr. Victoria Humphreys, historian and author of historical fiction.
And that's exactly what we're looking at this time, is rather than an historical subject or necessarily speaking to an historian themselves, we're looking at the importance of historical fiction. Over to you, Tori.
Thank you. Historical fiction can and frequently does serve as a portal into histories and historical figures that were previously unknown to us. Historical fiction is not the poor relation of history, and to prove it, we are very lucky to be joined today by Dr. Emma Venables, author of Fragments of a Woman, a work of fiction concerned with the lives of 5 women living in Nazi Germany. Over to you, Emma.
Thanks. As Victoria said, Fragments of a Woman follows the lives of 5 women in Nazi Germany, and was, I guess, I'll talk a little bit about my journey to writing Fragments of a Woman, which starts when I was quite young, and I'd say is largely influenced by my gran, who grew up in Liverpool and lived in Liverpool during World War II, and I was fascinated by her stories of life in Liverpool, which was the second most bombed city outside of London, and often the experiences I think are overlooked in favour of the narrative of London during World War II. So it was amazing to hear her stories, and so when I was beginning my time as a writer, I often wrote about World War II Liverpool. And as I was lucky enough to study creative writing as part of my degree, and as I was kind of progressing through my degrees, I started to think a little bit more about what about women and kind of like the other side of the war. So what was life like for German women during World War II? What was life like? What type of conversations were they maybe having with their granddaughters, if they were talking at all about their experiences? So when it came to writing my master's thesis, I decided to look at women. I started in kind of like the top. So I looked at women like Ava Brown and Magda Goebbels, and I looked at how fiction could help us understand the role of those women in Nazi society. And then when it came to doing my PhD, I wanted to kind of throw that open a little bit and look at kind of women in more generally in World War II Germany. And I think kind of perhaps the starting point for me and that piqued my interest in this topic was the very small amount of time we spent studying women in Nazi Germany in history in secondary school. And the kind of things that stick in my mind are the propaganda posters of women, Kinderküche, Kirche, children, church and kitchen. The fact that we got these very kind of stereotypical snapshots of what life was like for women in Nazi Germany, that they all loved the Führer, that they wanted to have babies for the Führer, and that was their role. And obviously, from looking beneath the surface, looking beyond that, I found that there was a lot more to life for women in Nazi Germany, and that's what I wanted to do with my novel. That was to kind of challenge these stereotypes. So the PhD was a great opportunity for me to kind of do that research and spend that time kind of going beneath the surface, because I find it really frustrating that that's the opinion that people have. I mean, even now it's very much us and them, and there's a lot of kind of narratives like that around. And I remember quite early on in my PhD, a TV series called Our Mothers, Our Fathers, or Generation War came out, and a lot of the narrative around that was how dare Germans present themselves as human beings, which was infuriating but good fodder for my PhD thesis, which, as I said, or might have said, was a creative writing PhD. So I had the novel, which was my kind of original contribution to knowledge, and then the critical exegesis that situated the novel within the kind of wider conversation about women in Nazi Germany and their experiences, and also then how women in Nazi Germany are represented in literature, which is available in English because my German is nicht so gut. So that's kind of how I came to the topic. I can waffle on more if you want.
No, I mean, no, that's brilliant. That's excellent. I mean, you've obviously kind of privileged the lives of 5 women in the novel, haven't you? Could you tell us about those women and their roles? And did you ever kind of reach a point where you're kind of whittling down how many to choose from? I mean, there must have been so many stories that you encountered. How do you choose those stories, and why?
Yeah, so I couldn't tell this novel from just one perspective. That was something that I decided very early on. In fact, very early on, it was going to be a collection of short stories, until my PhD supervisor, Doug Cowie, who's a fiction writer, kept saying to me, think of it as a novel. And I was like, but it's not a novel. And he was like, but think of it as one. And we had this kind of back and forth for what felt like a long time, until I was like, yeah, okay, it's a novel. Yeah. So he obviously saw that it's something that could be woven together. And so in terms of kind of, yeah, it was really hard to whittle it down. Originally, the novel had seven women.
Right.
So that included Magda Goebbels, who I'd written about in my MA thesis, and I just find really fascinating. So originally she was one of the characters, and then I had a Jewish character called Ava, who is still in the novel. Her family run the clothes shop in the novel,
Yeah.
but she had a first person testimony in the novel.
Okay.
So I had those 2 characters, and then I also had the characters that we have in the published version of the novel. So we have, let me try and remember them all. So we have Ingrid, who is a mother. Obviously, she's a woman. She's a mother, and her husband is a zealous Nazi. He's very kind of convinced, and she is grappling with what that means for her family in kind of early 1930s. Then we have Ingrid's daughter Laura, who is quite young when the novel begins, and she's the one that I think we see from a child kind of growing up, becoming a mother and wife herself. And she is in the Hitler Maidens. Her father's a convinced Nazi, so she's kind of brought up in that environment with a mother who is, I think I often see Ingrid as like an early form of resistance.
Yeah.
Like at a kind of domestic level, she tries to resist her husband. She kind of calls him out a little bit on his opinions. And obviously Laura has grown up in that environment where she essentially has to pick a side, and she, ultimately at the beginning is very much a daddy's girl. So, she is shooting in the garden, shooting her toys in the garden with her dad, and trying to kind of appease him and please him. And ultimately she marries Wilhelm, and she goes over to the Nazi East. And I won't go into too much detail.
Yeah.
But she makes some choices that a lot of feedback I've got from people is people are quite shocked by her actions.
Yeah.
So she, Laura is essentially the perpetrator figure in the novel, and I wanted to look at the perpetrator's perspective. I find that really interesting. I think it's really important that we look at history from various perspectives to kind of get a good understanding of why things happened and why people acted the way they did. So originally I told you the idea of a camp warder, but I think there's a danger with a female camp warder of it becoming very stereotypical.
Yeah.
They tend to be highly sexualized, and I kind of wanted to come away from that a little bit and look at maybe a different kind of perpetrator. So that's Laura. Then we have Liesel and Greta, who are in the early stages of the novel are a couple, but Liesl is somebody who toes the party line. She wants to fit in. She's very scared of the repercussions if she were found out, although essentially lesbians within Nazi society weren't officially kind of persecuted. They were often arrested for other crimes, but the idea was that women could still fulfill their lesbians could still fulfill their womanly duties, which was obviously to provide babies for the Führer. So but Liesl is very in tune with what's going on around her, and is very scared of being found out. So she marries a gay man to hide their identity. And then Greta joins the resistance. And that was also a really important perspective that I wanted to include, somebody who's kind of fighting against the regime. And then we have my personal favorite, Gisela, who is a prostitute in Nazi Germany. And that was the experience of prostitutes was perhaps the most interesting research that I did about how they were, you know, okay, but then actually no, and you know, they had to kind of be confined. They couldn't street walk, although they, you know, had relations with powerful men, and then also, you know, could be arrested and then sent to concentration camps, as Gisela is, and then also when the Nazis wanted to increase their work quotas in the concentration camps, women were selected to service the brothels, and the men would work, and if they worked well, they'd get a token to spend at the brothel. So again, you know, really an example of how women were bent and molded to meet the needs of the Nazi Party. And I think that's all of them.
Yeah, it's interesting because similar to your other feedback, I won't give any spoilers away, but when it comes to Laura, that was the most shocking moment for me as well, those kind of choices. When you were kind of researching the resistance character Greta, you know, I found that really interesting, and it was quite subtle actually, your telling of the resistance story. And Paul and I have kind of often gone to places where we've met Germans who talk about, actually I remember at the We Have Ways Festival, Paul, it was it was the relative of Himmler, wasn't it?
Of Himmler, yeah, that's right.
And she was sort of saying that in Germany, everybody sort of collectively, everybody claims that they've got a relative who was hiding a Jew in the cellar, kind of thing. All of a sudden, there's this history of we were all doing that. When, you know, she says that isn't the reality whatsoever. And when we met that lovely chap at the graveside, and he was talking about his grandfather, and he was saying it's not really clear of the role that his grandfather played in the war, but he hopes that his grandfather wasn't, you know, an ardent, terrible Nazi. Do you remember that?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he said that there was a spread of this kind of belief that people were hiding Jews in their cellars and so on, which kind of took away from the stark reality of that period, where people, you know, as you explain in your novel, had to make these choices about what kind of person they were and what path they took.
I was just wondering then, Emma, how did you come to tell that story? Did you find a lot of testimony that we can understand as being legitimate testimony of Germans, you know, very actively engaged in this kind of resistance?
Well, so for me, because my German isn't very good, and it's a huge regret of mine, and my dad once told me that I would regret not studying German at university, and I said, no, I won't. And here I am writing a novel about women in Nazi Germany. So I didn't really go into archives because, you know, I'm not good German language skills. So I did a lot of reading on the topic. I went to a lot of museums in Berlin. There's a fantastic museum on the resistance in Berlin. So I did a lot of research in that way. But I often was struck by the kind of small acts that people did. And I didn't really want to kind of get into the high drama you know, those big stories. I wanted Greta to be quite a kind of gentle presence, like a gentle kind of moral compass. But often I think that from my research, I found that women did amazing things. There were small things in the grand scheme of it, but, you know, things like pushing prams down streets with pamphlets underneath a baby, you know, having a chat and swapping shopping bags underneath the table, which can say might contain documents and things like that. So I wanted to hone in on those small acts that had huge significance, really, and also the ways that women could get around, you know, the Nazis. So things like, you know, using their feminine wiles to, you know, who would suspect the woman carrying shopping bags of actually, you know, helping out the Jews, and things like that.
And I think, sorry,
no,
I was going to say, I think it's really important to kind of highlight those small acts of resistance, isn't it? Because if people say, well, I'm nothing, I'm not big, I'm not grand, I have no status, I don't have this big job or this amount of power, so what can I do? But if you highlight those small kind of things, I think it's excellent for building up the picture of what those kind of acts of resistance don't make it into the history books.
No.
Okay, and if those acts of resistance aren't in the history books, then how can we say that they happened? So then we might take on that kind of narrative of nobody did anything, nobody did a thing. But actually, as your book shows, as your novel shows, that people did do things, they're just not big enough to make it into the history books. That kind of makes sense, because we tend to, I think societally, we kind of celebrate the big all the time, don't we? The high-ranking person, or the, you know, the most dastardly deed, or the most amazing deed. But actually, those kind of deeds are important because they might have just saved one person's life, or they might have given them a bit of light in that day, you know, giving somebody, I don't know, a crumb to eat, whatever, those kind of things.
Absolutely. And that reminds me of one of my favorite books, Alone in Berlin by Hans Fallada, where he tells the story of two real life resistors, Otto and Elise, who dropped anti-Nazi postcards around Berlin. And again, it's those small acts of, you know, someone picking it up and, you know, having their opinion changed or passing it along. You know, these really kind of small acts, but really daring and important acts. And again, you know, that novel is an example of, though, you know, bringing those stories to light and bringing them into the wider consciousness.
Yeah, and to be clear as well, those very small acts that you're describing, they might be small acts, but they carry the death penalty.
Yeah.
So you know, there's a real imbalance there, isn't there? It's kind
absolutely
of the risk is still the same.
Absolutely,
even if it's not that great kind of like spectacular act that we understand perhaps as spectacular.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
it's excellent. It's really,
I was going to say, from my point of view, what I found was interesting is that challenging the norm like that. I mean, setting your novel in Berlin. Berlin is a city that throughout its history has challenged the norm under all kinds of different regimes. Was that a kind of a deliberate choice to kind of funnel it through Berlin in that way, or was it just part of that wider aspect of challenging this idea that there can't be good Germans?
I don't think I could have said it anywhere else than Berlin. So when I first started writing about Berlin, I was writing about Magda Goebbels' last days in the bunker. So it just seemed logical to go above ground. And I started writing about Berlin before I'd actually been to Berlin, which was terrifying when I was in an airplane about to land in Berlin, because I was like, what if I'm a year into a PhD, what if I do not like this city? And my entire thesis is going to be built on this city, but I loved it. And like you said, yeah, it's a city that's challenged the norms, that has a very wide, varying history, and it just, it was just I was so glad that I had decided to write about Berlin once I'd visited it, and now I just always want to go back.
Go live there.
Oh my gosh, that would be a dream.
You need to speak German, and as your father said, you didn't learn it. Neither did I, by the way.
Well, I mean, when I was studying my PhD, bits of my German did come back. So I think if I was immersed in Berlin, I might get it back somehow.
You mentioned earlier about this character Eva, this Jewish character,
Mhm.
which we do see,
Yeah.
and you know, there's some lovely kind of interactions in the shop, and you know, you consistently bring her clothing through the wall. So even though we understand that she's been lost, there's this kind of record of her in the label of the dress and these kind of things, which I thought was beautifully done. But why did you not kind of privilege her in the end, you know, as a main character in the novel?
So I think I felt a little, looking back on it, I think I felt some awkwardness about representing the Jewish perspective. So she was a character that I really struggled to find my voice with.
Yeah.
So I think at one point I was telling the story, when I originally started my PhD, I was going to narrate the story through her shoes.
Oh, wow.
Um, it was going to be some sort of postmodern, you know, and then I decided there were just too many layers, and I just wanted to kind of present and represent these perspectives. So ultimately she ended up as a first person survivor testimony that framed the novel.
Yeah.
And that was the kind of form of narrative that worked best. It flowed quite easily when I was writing. It didn't feel too squeamish, you know, or awkward kind of stepping into this first person voice. But when I had an initial meeting with my publisher, she said it didn't quite work in terms of the rest of the novel, because Ava didn't actually have, so it was a present day testimony.
Right.
Ava didn't actually have a present day story. She was reflecting.
Yeah.
And that kind of hit the nail on the head for me, is that I hadn't given her a present day story, and it didn't quite fit with the other characters.
Mm-hmm.
So I felt that actually that Ava and her family are still in the novel. There's still a huge presence in the novel, if much more subtle.
Yeah.
But I felt that it worked better in that respect. I felt that her family's loss would be felt more if she didn't have that prominent narrative.
Yeah. Excellent. Paul, do you have any questions?
I was going to say that the kind of interesting thing for me is that when you look at the kind of characters that are in this, I guess there must only be fragmentary testimony of many women like this, particularly in Berlin at the end of the war, with the huge amount of women that were raped by Soviet forces when that came in. There was a silence really with that generation of women, and I guess that ties into what the point of these chats really is, the importance of fiction being able to tell those stories and give those women that voice.
Yeah, and the rape of German women at the end of the war was something that I felt that I couldn't not put in to the novel. It would have felt like I, in a way, was silencing them by turning away from that. So yeah, it's not an easy to read novel, but it was something. I mean, the articles that I read about the rape of German women was some of the hardest things that I read. And actually, you know, I think people often ask me, oh, how do you cope writing about this subject? Like, you know, and I think myself and a lot of kind of scholars I've spoken to become desensitized to it in a way, or would say that, you know, they become desensitized as a kind of coping mechanism. But I can vividly remember where I read about the rape of German women, and I vividly remember having to kind of come away from it because I felt sickened by what they'd experienced. And yeah, there is a silence about it, and I'm not entirely sure that people are aware of it. I mean, there's the fantastic memoir of A Woman in Berlin, which kind of touches on it. Well, doesn't touch on it. It kind of definitely brought it to a kind of wider population. And it's amazing how the women just get on with it because they have to. They, in a way, they kind of accept their fate. It is their fate, really. You know, they are the wrong. You know, their nation did wrong, so they have to. They just have to put up with being raped, but also tied in with that is, you know, Berlin at the end of the war, women were starving, they were trying to protect their children, you know, not sure what zone they were going to be in, who was going to be responsible for kind of governing them. So all of that, plus these horrific instances of rape, and that was just something that I felt I had to put into my novel. And my second novel, which I'm just editing, follows Laura in the first year, which some people are, you know, going to be not happy about, but follows Laura in the first year after the war, and the rape of German women is still hugely present in that novel as well. So yeah, absolutely, history or historical fiction, kind of, for me, I hope that it gives my readers a way in to maybe aspects of life in Nazi Germany and that immediate post-war period that they weren't aware of, and maybe they will then go and look at the, you know, the non-fiction, or go and visit Berlin or the museums and memorials there to kind of gain more knowledge about it.
Yeah, I think it's really important. You can't turn away from things like that. As a fiction author, there's that kind of idea that you get to choose. Yes, on some levels, but you can't choose to eradicate that record. And there is an emerging scholarship about rape, and, you know,
Yeah.
with and the Allies raping, not just the Soviets, the Americans, the British. They were all, you know, maybe some nations were worse than others, but they were all guilty of that offence throughout all of those kind of occupied countries. So I think it's really, really important that you highlight that. And you did, and you made it really feel like there was no question of them being raped. They would be raped.
Yes.
If they left their apartment to seek food for themselves, which they at some point would have to do, that would be what would happen. And I guess ultimately the next question is, but would they survive it? And, you know, it really does drive that home. And I think Paul and I, you know, had this conversation before, that wherever there's war that's just women and children being raped, they always suffer. So I think, you know, there's always right to kind of show those stories. People have to know that, and it's happening now, isn't it? So
yeah, I felt a very strong resonance with the present day, because, you know, as you probably found, if you went to Trek Tower, they've got all those murals depicting the Soviet progression of the Second World War, from the barbaric Nazi invasion through to what they describe as the liberation of Germany. And it shows these very kind of sweet images of women, German women, welcoming Soviet troops into East Prussia or Berlin or wherever it is. But of course, the reality was very, very different. So even from the memorialization of the conflict by the victors, there is already that attempt to mute the voices of those women. And half the women in Berlin would have been under Soviet control by 1945, 46 anyway, wouldn't they, with the kind of beginning of the Cold War?
Yeah. And I think it's that thing of, you know, they've been through a war where their homes often aren't safe. They're having to live underground to protect themselves from air raids. And in the latter years of the war, the Americans were bombing Berlin in daylight. So they could be standing in the queue for, you know, a shop or the water, and they could be, you know, throwing their children under themselves to try and protect them. And then the Russians come in, and, you know, when they're going outside, they're at risk, but also, you know, they're in basements hiding, and the Russians are going in and, you know, picking them off. So yeah, absolutely terrifying that, you know, even though the war was over, there was still, you know, they were seen as the spoils of war.
Yeah.
That they, you know, the men felt that it was their right to rape these women to, you know, gain, you know, avenge the crimes that had been committed.
And they were so disposable, weren't they?
Yeah.
I think in that they're kind of easy targets almost. This huge rampaging army with the rest of the Allied corps behind it comes charging into the streets of Berlin, and anything and everything in its path is fair game. That's how it sees it. And I guess it's hard as we move further and further from the Second World War and lose more and more of that generation to a point where they'll be gone soon. I guess maybe that's the point at which, through novels like yours, we begin to truly understand how nuanced that ending of the war was. That it's not as clear cut as good people on one side and bad people on the other.
Yeah, and I really wanted to explore that grey area, again, avoiding that, you know, with women, avoiding the stereotype of the victim and the perpetrator. You know, that there was a grey area where women would have had to have kind of stepped across that boundary to survive. They would have had to make difficult decisions depending on the situations they found themselves in, to guarantee their own survival and the survival of their children.
But I think also you haven't just shown German women as victims as well. You have shown them as perpetrators too, which I think is important. But yeah, we won't give anything away. But it's a fantastic novel, Emma, and you know, people really should read this. The writing is absolutely brilliant, but the story is fantastic. And as you say, these stories and the way that you've woven them together is seamless. It's just, you know, beautifully done. You kind of read it and go, oh right, oh right, yeah, right, like that, you know, just kind of putting bits in here and there, and it's fantastic. I wonder if, unless there's anything else you want to say, whether you'd like to finish with a reading of
I would love to.
Women.
I would love to. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to read, I am going to read Laura's first chapter, which is only a short one. But this follows Laura's mother's first chapter, Ingrid. So Ingrid, to kind of give a bit of context, Ingrid has woken up and has heard gunshots. So it's the early 1930s. And she goes downstairs into the garden and finds that Laura is shooting her toys with her father. Her dad is teaching her how to shoot. And Ingrid protests against this. She doesn't want Laura to know how to shoot. She doesn't see that Laura's going to need to know how to shoot. But her father is preparing Laura for a world where the rest of the world are going to be perhaps jealous of Germany, or there's going to be some kind of conflict. So this is Laura's first chapter. So Laura watches her mother follow her father into the house. Her hand aches from the gun's weight, so she massages it, watching her skin blanch under the pressure. She decides against going inside. She can hear her parents arguing. One of them, her father probably, slams the kitchen window so their voices muffle. Laura knows what they're saying. Her mother will be talking of men in uniform, harassing people as they walk the streets. Jews, her father will say. Innocent people, her mother will say. Necessary measures, her father will say. Unnecessary measures, her mother will snap back. Ingrid, her father's voice will take on the tone of a man pleading for respect. Victor, her mother's voice will remain defiant. I can't talk to you when you're in this mood, he will say, and storm out, leaving Laura to deal with her mother. Laura sighs and plops down onto the grass. She closes her eyes against the sunshine. She will not go inside until her mother comes outside and offers her lemonade. Lemonade is a mother's way of putting on a brave face, of pretending nothing has gone awry. Lemonade is a buffer, a full stop on an argument, a way of changing the subject, of not having to acknowledge a scene. She took Laura for lemonade at the Quai d'Orsay after the incident outside Kaufmann's a few weeks ago, when a man in the same uniform as her father blocked their path to the tailors. Don't buy from the Jews, he said. Are you talking about the Kaufmanns, her mother had asked. The man had stared at them, at Laura in her white blouse and blue skirt, at her mother in her beige summer suit. Laura looked away, pretended to be in the throes of a daydream. Her gaze fell on a girl, perhaps around her own age, in the window of the store. The girl threw a dress over the head of a mannequin, pulled it down with a well-practiced hand. She then retrieved a pin from the pincushion which rested between her lips and gathered the material at the dress's waistline. Laura wondered if the girl was aware of the exchange going on between her mother and the man, whether she could hear their conversation through the glass, or whether she was purely engrossed in the task at hand. I always shop here, and always will, Laura's mother said. She walked past the man, dragging Laura by her elbow. In the store, her mother shook Herr Kaufmann's hand with an unusual intensity and purchased more than she needed. 2 shirts, when her father had only asked for 1, 3 ties, when her father didn't need them. Thank you, Herr Kaufmann. And Laura would love a new dress, she said. Laura shook her head, frowned. Yes, you would. You were admiring the dress in the window. No, I wasn't, Laura said. Yes, you were. No, I wasn't, Mother. Laura felt herself blush. Ingrid shrugged. She promised Herr Kaufmann she would be back again soon and said goodbye to the girl with the mannequin. That really is a lovely dress, Laura. Outside, she smiled at the man as he dissuaded another Berliner from entering the store. Laura looked down at the street below, hoping the cobbles might suddenly split open and devour her and her mother. Lemonade, Laura, at the Quai d'Orsay? The same situation occurred. Laura felt every one of her limbs redden as her mother dragged her past. She refused lemonade in the department store, refused to utter a word to her mother in the cafe on the S-Bahn over dinner. Her father frowned at the shirts, at the ties. Is the quality not good enough? Her mother asked. The quality is fine, Ingrid. It's just... Laura stood in the doorway to the living room and smiled at him. She wanted to apologize, to say she did try and stop her mother, but instead she shrugged as if they were somehow allied in silence. Her mother comes out to the garden without lemonade and sits on the grass beside Laura. She strokes Laura's hair and tucks a stray strand behind her ear. Laura sits up, tilts her head so her mother blocks the sunlight from her eyes. I'm sorry you had to witness that, Laura, her mother says. Father believes the Jews are bad. Adolf Hitler believes. The voices in the wireless believe. So why do you have to disagree? Your father isn't always right, Laura, but let's keep that between you and me for now.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Emma. That was really, really lovely. It was really great. And
I really...
Sorry, go on, Paul.
I was going to say, I really like, because Berlin is also my favourite city. It's a place that I could easily move to tomorrow in some respects, but I kind of love the sense of place. As an historian, I love the connection between what we know of history and the landscape, and I really felt the strong presence and your love of Berlin in your writing.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Yeah, congratulations on a fantastic debut novel. It's brilliant. So I suppose we should end it there, holding up Emma's book, Fragments of a Woman, buy now from Adarin Press and all good bookshops and all the usual places. Is that right?
It is.
Excellent.
And we'll put a link to Emma's website, social media, and a link to where they can buy the book as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, Emma, and being our first author.
Thank you for having me.
No, thanks, Emma. That's been fantastic.
We'll hopefully have you on when you've written your sequel.
That'd be wonderful.
More Berlin talk. That'll be great.
Yes.
Excellent.
Great.
Thanks very much, folks. Goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Bye.
Until next time with History with Humphreys and Reed.